Hi guys, and thank you so much for joining me. If you are new to my channel, I'm Kat and I usually talk about true crime, conspiracies and all sorts of related things. In today's video I want to talk to you about the mysterious disappearance of the 5 Sodder children. But before we get started, just a quick disclaimer. All the information that I'm giving to you in today's video is found online in the public domain. I also don't mean any disrespect to anyone I talk about in the video. This is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Thank you so much. So, let's get into it. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1945, a fire destroyed the Sodder home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, United States. At the time, the house was lived in by George Sodder, his wife Jennie, and 9 of their 10 children. The oldest child, their son, was away in the army at the time. But let's start from the beginning with George and Jennie, the parents. George Sodder was born with the name Giorgio Sodder in Tula, Sardinia, in Italy, in 1895. He immigrated to the US 13 years later with an older brother who went back home as soon as both of them cleared customs at Ellis Island. Sodder eventually found work on the railroads in Pennsylvania, carrying water and other supplies to workers. After a few years, he took more permanent work as a driver in Smithers, West Virginia. He then started his own trucking company, at first hauling fill dirt to construction sites and later hauling coal that was mined in the region. Jennie Cipriani, a storekeeper's daughter in Smithers who had also immigrated from Italy in her childhood, became George's wife. The couple settled outside nearby Fayetteville, which had a large population of Italian immigrants, in a 2-story timber frame house 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers north of town. In 1923, they had the first of their 10 children. George's business prospered and they became one of the most respected middle-class families around. But George had strong opinions about many subjects and was not shy to express them, sometimes estranging people. In particular, his opposition to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini led to some strong arguments with other members of the immigrant community. The last of the Sodder children, Sylvia, was born in 1943. By then, their second oldest son, Joe, left home to serve in the military during World War II. The following year, Mussolini was executed. However, George's criticism of the late dictator left some hard feelings. In October 1945, a visiting life insurance salesman, after being rejected, warned George that his house would go up in smoke and his children are going to be destroyed because of the dirty remarks George was making about Mussolini. Another visitor to the house seeking work went around the back of the house and warned George that a pair of fuse boxes would cause a fire someday. George was surprised by what this man said, especially since he just had the house rewired when an electric stove was installed and the local electric company said it was safe. In the weeks before Christmas that year, George's older sons also noticed a strange car parked along the main highway through town, its occupants watching the younger Sodder children as they returned from school. The Sodders celebrated on Christmas Eve 1945. Marion, the oldest daughter, was working at a dime store in downtown Fayetteville, and she surprised 3 of her younger sisters, Martha, 12 years old, Jennie, 8 years old, and Betty, 5 years old, with new toys she bought for them as gifts. The younger children were so excited that they asked their mother if they could stay up past what would have been their usual bedtime. At 10 p.m., Jennie told them they could stay up a little later just on that occasion as long as the 2 oldest boys, who were still awake, 14-year-old Maurice and his 9-year-old brother Louis, remembered to put the cows in and feed the chickens before going to bed themselves. George and the 2 oldest boys, John 23 and George Jr. 16, who spent the day working with their father, were already asleep. After reminding the children of the chores, she took 2-year-old Sylvia upstairs with her and they went to bed together. The telephone rang at 12:30 a.m. Jennie woke up and went to answer it. The caller was a woman whose voice she didn't recognize, asking for a name she was not familiar with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses in the background. Jennie told the caller she reached a wrong number, later remembering the woman's weird laugh. Jennie hung up and then returned to bed yet again. As she did, she noticed that the lights were still on and the curtains were not drawn. Two things the children normally attended to when they stayed up later than their parents. Marian fell asleep on the living room couch, so Jennie assumed the other children who stayed up later went back up to the attic where they slept. She closed the curtains, turned out the lights, and returned to bed. At 1 a.m., Jennie was again woken up by a sound of an object hitting the house's roof with a loud bang, then a rolling noise. After hearing nothing else, she went back to sleep. After another half an hour, she wakes up again, smelling smoke. When she got up again, she found that the room George used for his office was on fire around the telephone line and fuse box. Jennie woke him up and he in turn woke up his older sons. Both parents and four of their children, Marian, Sylvia, John and George Jr., escaped the house. They frantically yelled to the children upstairs but heard no response. They could not go up there as the stairway itself was already on fire. John said in his first police interview after the fire that he went up to the attic to alert his siblings sleeping there, but he later changed his story to say that he only called up there and didn't actually see them. Efforts to find help and rescue the children were unexpectedly complicated. The phone didn't work, so Marian ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. A driver on the nearby road had also seen the flames and called from a nearby tavern. They too were unsuccessful either because they could not reach the operator or because the phone there turned out to be broken. Either the neighbor or the passing motorist was eventually successful in reaching the fire department from another phone in the center of town. George, the father, barefoot, climbed the wall and broke open an attic window, cutting his arm in the process. He and his sons intended to use a ladder to the attic to rescue the other children, but it was not in its usual spot, resting against the house, and could not be found anywhere nearby. A water barrel that could have been used to extinguish the fire was frozen solid. George then tried to pull both of the trucks he used in his business up to the house and use them to climb to the attic window, but neither of them would start despite having worked perfectly during the previous day. Frustrated, the 6 Sodders who escaped had no choice but to watch the house burn down and collapse over the next 45 minutes. They assumed the other 5 children had perished in the blaze. The fire department, low on manpower due to the war and relying on individual firefighters to call each other, didn't respond until later that morning. Chief F.J. Morris said the next day that the already slow response was further hampered by his inability to drive the fire truck, requiring that he wait until someone who could drive was available. The firefighters, one of whom was a brother of Jennie's, could do little but look through the ashes that were left in the Sodders' basement. By 10 a.m., Morris told the Sodders that they did not find any bones, as might have been expected if the other children were in the house as it burned. According to another account, they did find a few bone fragments and internal organs but chose not to tell the family. It has also been noted by modern fire professionals that their search was cursory at best. Nevertheless, Morris believed that the 5 children unaccounted for died in the fire, suggesting it had been hot enough to burn their bodies completely. Morris told George to leave the site undisturbed so that the state fire marshal's office could conduct a more thorough investigation. However, after 4 days, George and his wife could not bear the site anymore, so he bulldozed 5 feet 1.5 meters of dirt over the site with the intention of converting it to a memorial garden for the lost children. The local coroner convened an inquest the next day, which held that the fire was an accident caused by faulty wiring. Among the jurors was the man who threatened George that his house would be burned down and his children destroyed in retribution for his anti-Mussolini remarks. Death certificates for the 5 children were issued on December 30th. The local newspaper contradicted itself, stating that all the bodies had been found, but then later in the same story reporting that only part of one body was recovered. George and Jennie were too grief-stricken to attend the funeral on January the 2nd, 1946, although their surviving children did. This is really strange. Something smells really fishy here. Not long afterward, as they began to rebuild their lives, the Sodders started to question all of the official findings about the fire. They wondered why, if it had been caused by an electrical problem, the family's Christmas lights remained on throughout the fire's early stages, when the power should have gone out. Then they found a ladder that was missing from the side of the house on the night of the fire at the bottom of an embankment 75 feet 23 meters away from the house. I'm also wondering how come nobody heard those kids shouting and screaming from the attic whilst the house was on fire. I mean, yeah, I get that, okay, you can't see them because of the flames, but before inhaling too much smoke and, you know, passing out, let's say passing out from inhaling the smoke, they would have screamed from the top of their lungs, from the bottom of their lungs. They would have been scared to death in there. They would definitely be screaming and probably be hurt. But this is another strange thing. None of the kids, the 5 kids, were heard screaming or shouting, doing something anyway. A telephone repairman told the Sodders that the house's phone line didn't burn through in the fire, as they initially believed, but it was actually cut by someone who was willing and able to climb 14 feet 4.3 meters up the pole and reach 2 feet 61 centimeters away from it to do so. A man, which the neighbors saw stealing a block and tackle from the property around the time of the fire, was identified and arrested. He admitted to the theft and claimed he was the one who cut the phone line, thinking it was a power line, but denied having anything to do with the fire. However, no record identifying the suspect exists, and why he would have wanted to cut any utility lines to the Sodder house while stealing the block and tackle has never been explained. Jennie said in 1968 that if he would have cut the power line, she and her husband, along with their other 4 children, would never have been able to make it out of the house. Jennie also had trouble accepting Morris's beliefs that all traces of the children's bodies had been burned completely in the fire. Many of the household appliances were found still recognizable in the ash, along with fragments of the tin roof. She compared the results of the fire with a newspaper account of a similar house fire that she read around the same time that killed a family of 7. Skeletal remains of all the victims were reported to have been found in that case. Jennie burned small piles of animal bones to see if they would be completely consumed. None ever were. An employee of a local crematorium she contacted told her that human bones remain even after bodies are burned at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit or 1090 degrees Celsius for 2 hours, far longer and hotter than the house fire could have been. The Sodders truck's failure to start was also considered. George believed they were tampered with, perhaps by the same man who stole the block and tackle and cut the phone line. However, one of his sons-in-law told the Charleston Gazette-Mail in 2013 that he believed Sodder and his sons might have, in their rush to start the trucks, flooded the engines. Some accounts have suggested the wrong number phone call to the Sodder house might have also somehow been connected to the fire and disappearance of the children. However, investigators later located the woman who made the call. She confirmed it was a wrong number on her part. As spring approached, the Sodders, as they said they would, planted flowers in the soil bulldozed over the house. Jennie tended it carefully for the rest of her life. However, further developments in early 1946 reinforced the family's belief that the children they were remembering might in fact be alive somewhere. Evidence emerged which supported their belief that the fire didn't start because of the electrical fault and was instead set deliberately. The driver of a bus that passed through Fayetteville late Christmas Eve said he saw some people throwing balls of fire at the house. A few months later, when the snow melted, Sylvia found a small, hard, dark green rubber ball-like object in the bush nearby. George, recalling his wife's account of a loud thump on the roof before the fire, said it looked like a pineapple bomb, a hand grenade or some other incendiary device used in combat. The family later claimed that, contrary to the fire marshal's conclusion, the fire had started on the roof, although by then there was no way to prove it. Other witnesses claimed to have seen the children themselves. One woman who had been watching the fire from the road said she saw some of them peering out of a passing car while the house was burning. Now this could very well explain the reason why nobody heard those children scream and shout. It is possible that the fire was set on purpose as a distraction to remove the 5 children. They were the people in the car watching the children come home from school on several occasions, so they were probably watching their family and the routine, and maybe they set the fire as a distraction to take those kids away. Because Jennie even found it strange that the lights were still up, the curtains were not pulled, and those 5 kids that stay later than usual before going to bed on that Christmas Eve to look at the gifts. So this could be a possibility. Another woman at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston said she served them breakfast the next morning and noted the presence of a car with Florida license plates in the rest stop's parking lot as well. The Sodders hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley from the nearby town of Golly Bridge to look into the case. Tinsley learned that the insurance salesman who threatened them with a fire a year before over George's anti-Mussolini sentiments had been on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire an accident, and told this to the Sodders. He also learned of rumors around Fayetteville that despite his report to the Sodders that no remains had been found in the ashes, Morris found a heart which he later packed into a metal box and secretly buried. Now you see, that man being on the jury, obviously he was biased, and maybe if all the jurors in that jury were local people, they already know about the Sodders, in particular George's strong views against Mussolini, and maybe they had a grudge on him. So, you know, the fire being deemed electrical fault, I don't know about that, but if the jury is biased, they won't be making an impartial decision, that's for sure. Morris had apparently confessed this to a local minister who confirmed it to George. George and Tinsley went to Morris and confronted him with this news. Morris agreed to show the two where he buried the metal box, and they dug it up. They took what they found inside the box to a local funeral director, who after examining it told them it was in reality fresh beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. Later, more rumors circulated around Fayetteville that Morris had afterwards admitted the box with the liver had indeed not come from the fire originally. He had supposedly placed it there in the hope that the Sodders would find it and be satisfied that the missing children had indeed died in the fire. George did not wait for reports of sightings to come in. Sometimes he made them himself. After seeing a girl in a magazine picture of a young ballet dancer in New York City who looked like one of his missing daughters, Betty, he drove all the way to the girls' school in New York, where his repeated demands to see the girl himself were refused. Which honestly, it's understandable, and on its own this doesn't seem to be out of the ordinary. Because, you know, a stranger going to demand to see a girl at school, that's a bit, you know, no, I don't think any parent would trust that. He also tried to interest the FBI in investigating what he considered a kidnapping. Director J. Edgar Hoover personally responded to his letters. Although I would like to be of service, he wrote, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau. If the local authorities requested the Bureau's assistance, he added, he would of course direct agents to assist, but the Fayetteville police and fire departments declined to do so. In August 1949, George was able to persuade Oscar Hunter, a Washington DC pathologist, to supervise a new search through the dirt at the house site. After a very thorough search, artifacts including a dictionary that belonged to the children and some coins were found. Several small bone fragments were unearthed, determined to have been human vertebrae. The bone fragments were sent to Marshall T. Newman, a specialist at the Smithsonian Institution. They were confirmed to be lumbar vertebrae, all from the same person. Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been 16 or 17 years, Newman's report said. The top limit of age should be about 22, since the centra, which normally fuse at 23, are still unfused. Thus, given this age range, it was not very likely that these bones were from any of the 5 missing children, since the oldest, Maurice, had been 14 at the time. Although the report allowed that the vertebrae of a boy his age sometimes were advanced enough to appear to be at the lower end of the range. Newman added that the bone showed no sign of exposure to the flame. Further, he agreed that it was very strange those bones were the only ones found, since a wood fire of such short duration should have left full skeletons of all of the children behind. The report concluded that the vertebrae had instead most likely come from the dirt that George had bulldozed over the site. Later, Tinsley supposedly confirmed that the bone fragments had come from a cemetery in nearby Mount Hope, but could not explain why they have been taken from there or how they came to be at the fireside. The Smithsonian returned the bone fragments to George in September 1949, according to its records. Their current location, however, is unknown. The investigation and its findings attracted national attention, and the West Virginia legislature held 2 hearings on the case in 1950. Afterwards, however, Governor Okie L. Pateson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett told the Sodders the case was hopeless and closed it at the state level. The FBI decided it had jurisdiction as a possible interstate kidnapping, but dropped the case after 2 years of following fruitless leads. With the end of official efforts to resolve the case, the Sodders did not give up hope. They had flyers printed up with pictures of the children, offering a $5,000 reward, soon doubled, for information that would have settled the case for even one of the children. In 1952, they put up a billboard at the site of the house and another along US Route 60 near Ainstead with the same information. It would in time become a landmark for traffic through Fayetteville on US Route 19, today State Route 16. The family's efforts soon brought another reported sighting of the children after the fire. Ida Crutchfield, a woman who ran a Charleston hotel, claimed to have seen the children approximately a week afterwards. I do not remember the exact date, she said in the statement. The children had come in around midnight with 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to her to be of Italian extraction. When she attempted to speak with the children, one of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me. She recalled that they left the hotel early the next morning. Investigators today don't, however, consider her story credible, as she had only first seen photos of the children 2 years after the fire, 5 years before she came forward. In a way, what she's saying would make sense if you think about it. Let's say that in the middle of the night, so it was around 12, she gets this phone call. Jennie gets the phone call, she answers the phone, and this lady, she's asking for a name that Jennie doesn't know. It could be that this was just a call to check and make sure that, you know, everyone is where they should be before the fire is set. And so midnight would make sense, maybe because maybe the kids were taken from the attic before the phone call. I'm wondering if it could be a possibility. So if the kids would be taken from the house before the phone call, then it would make sense that the woman calls at 12 just to, check. And the fire was a distraction, in my opinion. George followed up leads in person, traveling to the areas from where tips had come. A woman from St. Louis, Missouri claimed Martha was being held in a convent there. A bar patron in Texas claimed to have overheard two other people making incriminating statements about a fire that happened on Christmas Eve in West Virginia some years before. None of those proved significant. When George heard later that a relative of Jennie's in Florida had children that looked similar to his, the relative had to prove the children were his own before George was satisfied. In 1967, George went to the Houston area to investigate another tip. A woman there had written to the family saying that Louis had revealed his true identity to her one night after having too much to drink. She believed that he and Maurice were both living in Texas somewhere. However, George and his son-in-law, Grover Paxton, were unable to speak with her. Police there were able to help them find the two men she had indicated, but they denied being the missing sons. Paxton said years later that doubts about their denial lingered in George's mind for the rest of his life. Another letter that they received that year brought the Sodders what they believed was the most credible evidence that at least Louis was still alive. One day, Jennie found in the mail a letter addressed to her, postmarked in Central City, Kentucky, with no return address. Inside was a picture of a young man of around 30 years of age with features strongly resembling Louis's, who would have been in his 30s if he had survived. On the back was written, Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Little boys, and a number A90132 or 35. The family then hired another private detective to go to Central City, Kentucky and look into this, but the investigator never reported back to the Sodders and they were unable to locate him afterwards. It is possible that this investigator actually scammed them of their money. The picture nonetheless gave them hope. They added it to the billboard, leaving Central City out of it and any other published information out of fear that Louis might come to harm, and put an enlargement of it over their fireplace. George admitted to the Charleston Gazette-Mail late the next year that the lack of information had been like hitting a rock wall. We can't go any further. He nevertheless vowed to continue. Time is running out for us, he admitted in another interview around that time. But we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them. George Sodder died in 1969 and sadly, he was never able to find out exactly what happened to his 5 missing children. It's so sad, really. He died without knowing. Jennie and her surviving children, except John, who never talked about the night of the fire, except to say that the family should accept it and get on with their lives, continued to seek answers to their questions about the missing children's fate. After George's death, Jennie stayed in the family home, putting up fencing around it and adding additional rooms. For the rest of her life, she wore black in mourning and tended the garden at the site of the former house. After her death in 1989, the family finally took the weather-worn billboard down. The surviving Sodder children, joined by their own children, continued to publicize the case and investigative leads. They, along with older Fayetteville residents, have theorized that the Sicilian mafia was trying to extort money from George and the children may have been taken by someone who knew about the planned arson and said they would be safe if they left the house. They were possibly taken back to Italy. If the children had survived all those years and were aware that their parents and siblings had survived too, the family believes they may have avoided contact in order to keep them from harm. Sylvia Sodder Paxton, the youngest in the family, died this year. She was in the house on the night of the fire, which she said was her earliest memory. I was the last one of the kids to leave home, she recalled to the Gazette-Mail in 2013. She and her father often stayed up late talking about what might have happened. I experienced their grief for a long time. She believed that her siblings survived that night and assisted with efforts to find them and publicize the case. Her daughter said in 2006, "She promised my grandparents she wouldn't let the story die, that she would do everything she could." In the 21st century, these efforts have come to include online forums like websleuths.com, in addition to media coverage. The increase in the coverage has led some who have examined the case to believe that the children did in fact die in 1945. George Bragg, a local author who wrote about the case in his 2012 book West Virginia's Unsolved Murders, believes that John was telling the truth in his original account when he said he tried to physically awaken his siblings before fleeing the house. He allows that that conclusion may still not be correct. Logic tells you they probably did burn up in the fire, but you can't always go by logic. Stacey Horn, who did a segment on the case for National Public Radio around its 60th anniversary in 2005, also believes the children's death in the fire is the most plausible solution. In a post on her blog with material she had to cut from her story for Time, she noted that the fire had continued to smolder all night after the house collapsed and that 2 hours was not enough time to search the ash thoroughly. Even if it had been, the firefighters might not have known what to look for. However, she said there is enough genuine weirdness about this whole thing that if someday it is learned that the children did not die in the fire, I won't be shocked. During the fire, George, Jennie, and 4 of the 9 children escaped. The oldest son was away in the army at that time. The bodies of the other 5 children have never been found. The Sodders believed for the rest of their lives that the 5 missing children survived. The Sodders never rebuilt the house, instead converting the site into a memorial garden to their lost children. In the 1950s, as they came to doubt that the children died, the family put up a billboard at the site along State Route 16 with pictures of the 5, offering a reward for information that would bring closure to the case. It remained up until shortly after Jennie Sodder's death in 1989. In support of their belief that the children survived, the Sodders pointed to a number of unusual circumstances before and during the fire. George disputed the fire department's finding that the blaze was electrical in origin, pointing out that he recently had the house rewired and inspected. He and his wife suspected arson, leading to theories that the children had been taken by the Sicilian mafia, perhaps in retaliation for George's outspoken criticism of Benito Mussolini and the fascist government of his native Italy. State and federal efforts to investigate the case further in the early 1950s brought no new information. The family did, however, later receive what may have been a picture of one of the boys as an adult during the 1960s. The Sodder grandchildren continued to publicize the case in the 21st century in the media and online. And with this I'll end today's video. Thank you so much guys for watching. Please do let me know in the comments below what is your theory. What do you think happened with the Sodder children, with the 5 missing Sodder children? If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It doesn't cost you anything, it's free and it helps me and my channel, and the more likes I get on the video, the more YouTube will push it on the platform. It really does help me. Thank you so much guys. Take care and stay safe. Bye!